lantern's blue flame flickered, and with it, a buried secret came to light. Welcome to Revenge Oath. I'm your moderator, Conan Doyle. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Your presence keeps the mystery burning bright. Glad you're here. A lantern flared blue, and with it, a secret long buried lit the night. Welcome to Revenge Oath. I'm your moderator, Conan Doyle. Drop a comment. Where are you joining this mystery from? Your curiosity keeps these stories glowing. Thanks for being here. It was in the first week of November, in that particular season of damp fogs and sharp winds, that Sherlock Holmes and I found ourselves unexpectedly idle in our quarters at 221B Baker Street. Holmes was unusually restless, stretched languidly upon the settee, with a Turkish cigarette burning low between his fingers, while I attempted in vain to interest myself in the medical journals that had accumulated on my writing desk. London, at that hour, had surrendered entirely to the oppressive weight of the evening fog. Street lamps glowed dimly, like drowning stars, and the occasional clatter of a hansom cab sounded ghost-like, as though heard through several layers of heavy velvet. Holmes had remained in contemplative silence for nearly half an hour, his eyes fixed on the intricate patterns formed by tobacco smoke curling toward the ceiling. Finally, without shifting his gaze, he spoke. The man in the grey ulster who hurried past our window 10 minutes ago is presently returning, Watson. I suspect he has made up his mind to call upon us. I glanced toward the window, seeing only a blur of amber and mist beyond the glass. You saw him before? I asked. I saw his reflection in the brass nameplate across the street. His boots told me the rest. Before I could inquire further, a brisk knock at the door confirmed Holmes's prediction. Mrs. Hudson, with her usual efficiency, showed in a tall man with a military bearing and rein on his shoulders. He introduced himself in clipped tones. Colonel Percival Stratton. I am sorry to arrive unannounced, Mr. Holmes, but time is of the essence. A matter has occurred which, well, frankly, it has baffled both the local police and my own sense of reason. Holmes inclined his head with polite detachment. Pray, be seated, Colonel. You speak of time being of the essence. Is it a disappearance, a theft, or a death? A death, sir. Sudden, without cause, and marked by the most infernal sight I have ever witnessed. Holmes leaned forward now, his eyes alight. Do go on. Colonel Stratton removed his gloves with the methodical precision of a man long accustomed to discipline. It happened 2 nights ago, in the village of Marshbank, some 30 miles south of London. My late brother, Harold Stratton, lived there in a converted parsonage, an eccentric fellow, retired chemist, reclusive, but well regarded. At approximately 10 o'clock that evening, a servant reported seeing an unnatural blue light flickering from his study window. The door was locked. By the time it was broken down, Harold was dead, slumped in his armchair, eyes open, mouth slack. No sign of struggle, no wound, no cause. You say blue light? Holmes repeated sharply. Yes, a lantern of sorts was found burning beside him, unlike any I've seen. The flame was pale as moonlight and gave off no heat. Watson, that is to say, I, shifted in my chair. No heat at all. None. And it had not extinguished itself by morning. Holmes stood and paced to the window. He tapped one long finger against the glass thoughtfully. A lantern that burns blue and cold, a door locked from within, and a death without mark or motive. Curious indeed. The coroner could determine no cause, Stratton continued. No poison. No injury. The only oddity, a faint, silvery residue on the deceased's collar and fingertips, as though he had handled, I don't know what. And the lantern? Holmes asked. Removed by the constable. It is at the Marshbank station, under lock and key. But they haven't the faintest idea what to do with it. Holmes turned suddenly to me. Watson, pack your valise. We take the early train to Marshbank tomorrow. Colonel Stratton, you will accompany us? With pleasure. I'd be grateful for your assistance, Mr. Holmes. My brother deserves at least the dignity of an answer. As the colonel departed into the damp November night, Holmes resumed his place on the settee, fingers steepled, eyes closed. "A lantern that burns blue," he murmured half to himself. "It is not the flame, Watson, that interests me, but the reason someone wished it seen." And with that cryptic remark, he fell into one of his profound silences, leaving me with little to do but stoke the fire, check the railway timetable, and wonder what devilry awaited us in the quiet village of Marshbank. The following morning broke grey and silent, with a drizzle misting the windows of Baker Street. Holmes, who had slept little, if at all, was already dressed and at the hearth when I emerged from my room, valise in hand. He was sipping the last of his morning coffee, a sheaf of notes tucked under his arm. "You've brought the chemical texts I asked for?" he inquired without looking up. "I have," I replied, gesturing to the leather case at my side. "Though I still don't understand what use you'll have for a compendium of phosphorus derivatives and flame coloration studies, unless—" "Precisely," he said, rising to his feet with a glint in his eye. "Unless our so-called unnatural flame has a perfectly natural origin masked by theatrical cunning. Come, Watson, there is no better laboratory than the world itself." By 8:30, we were on the train bound for Marshbank. The countryside passed in swift, rain-specked blur. Holmes remained silent for much of the journey, his fingertips pressed together, eyes half closed, not asleep, but deep within that peculiar trance of thought into which he retreated when the puzzle at hand began to stir in his mind. Colonel Stratton joined us in the third carriage, as arranged. He brought with him a bundle of documents from his brother's estate, including a sketch of the room in which the death had occurred, and a journal of Harold Stratton's more recent chemical studies. He had no known enemies, the colonel said quietly as we reviewed the notes. No debts, no romantic entanglements. He kept to himself, a few correspondents in scientific circles, but otherwise— He trailed off, gazing out the rain-blurred window. He was alone. Holmes lifted one brow. "Alone is a state not always without witnesses, Colonel, especially when the intellect is active. Men of science often believe they are surrounded only by ideas, until someone notices they are standing too close to something dangerous." When we arrived at Marshbank Station, the weather had grown sullen. The village itself was a huddle of gabled roofs and brick chimneys, tucked against the edge of a low ridge where the trees thickened into copse. The parsonage stood at the far end of the village, apart from its neighbours, flanked by hedgerows and a wrought-iron gate still marked with the initials HS inside. The air held a faint odour of must and chemicals. The servant, a cautious man named Tiller, showed us to the study without much conversation. Holmes's eyes darted immediately to the walls, the floorboards, the hearth. The furnishings were few: a broad oak desk, an armchair still bearing the impression of a recent occupant, and beside it a brass tripod with an empty cradle where the lantern had once rested. Holmes crouched near the cradle. "So, this is where the lantern burned blue." "Yes, sir," said Tiller. "I saw the glow from the corridor and raised the alarm. Mr. Stratton would never have used any such light for reading. He kept a kerosene lamp by the desk." "And the door was locked?" "From the inside, sir. Bolt drawn, window shutters barred too. The constable had to batter it open." Holmes rose, stepped to the hearth, and crouched again. He ran his gloved fingers gently across the bricks, then sniffed them. "Notice anything, Watson?" I bent down beside him. "Ash, soot, nothing unusual. Wait." I touched a slight residue, glimmering faintly silver in the firelight. "This, the same the colonel mentioned." "Indeed. And not typical of wood ash, is it?" Holmes smiled faintly. Our silent witness begins to speak. He examined the floor with a magnifying glass, tracing small grooves in the floorboards between the study and the corridor. "Tiller, Did your master make frequent use of this room in the evenings? Every night, sir. Sometimes late into the morning. And yet the dust here suggests these boards were disturbed only recently. What of visitors? Tiller hesitated. None, sir. Except the postman on Thursdays and, well, there was a Miss Glenbrook. She came 2 days prior to the incident. Holmes straightened abruptly. Miss Glenbrook? A young woman. Said she'd known Mr. Stratton's wife. May she rest in peace. She brought letters, I believe. Colonel Stratton frowned. This is the first I've heard of her. Holmes paced to the window, staring through the iron lattice at the drizzle beyond. She came bearing letters? And did your master seem distressed by her visit? Tiller nodded slowly. He was agitated, sir. Pale, trembling. He retired early that night. Didn't dine. Holmes turned toward the desk and opened the top drawer. It was locked. With a swift flick of his knife and a practiced hand, he undid the latch and retrieved a bundle of papers tied in a faded ribbon. Watson, he said, handing them to me. Read, but do not speak. I untied the bundle and scanned the topmost letter. The handwriting was delicate, the paper worn at the edges. It was a love letter, unmistakably so, dated some 15 years earlier, and signed Eleanor G. It appeared Mr. Stratton had been in correspondence with someone his family had not known, someone he had not married. The next letter was from the same hand, but the tone had changed. Accusatory, heartbroken. Then abruptly they stopped, until, tucked between two scientific reports, I found one far newer, dated only a week ago. You thought I had forgotten. You thought I would stay buried like the rest. But I remember the lantern Harold. I remember the cold light you swore would change the world. You never answered for what it cost me. Now it is your turn to see clearly. E.g., I looked up at Holmes. He had not needed the letters to confirm what he already suspected. We departed the house and made our way to the village constable's office. The lantern had been kept under lock and key, but the constable, one Sergeant Merriman, a ruddy man of few words, allowed Holmes to examine it under supervision. The device was a curious contraption, brass housing with a reinforced lens, and a chamber filled with a powdery blue substance, like crushed crystal. Holmes studied it for nearly 10 minutes, then turned to Merriman. Has anyone else handled this since the night of the incident? No, sir. It gives folks the chills. We left it be. Wise. Watson, note the composition. Copper salts, likely hydrated, combined with a volatile base. It burns blue and cold not by magic, but by clever chemistry. We returned to the parsonage by mid-afternoon, and Holmes, invigorated by his findings, settled into the study with renewed purpose. As he compared the flame residues, letters, and ash samples, I asked the question that had been lingering since morning. Holmes, do you believe Miss Glenbrook intended to kill Mr. Stratton, or simply frighten him? Holmes looked up from his instruments. Intent is never so simple, Watson. A woman scorned, especially when abandoned in grief and silence, may believe justice takes 1,000 forms. But this was no accident. He tapped the final letter with one finger. She lured him into lighting the lantern himself, the lantern whose chemical cocktail was designed to rob him of breath without a mark. Not poison in the body, but in the air itself, an act of vengeance wrapped in science. And the residue? Likely a compound reacting to the chemical vapor, a trace left on the skin, insignificant to the eye, but damning to the trained observer. The room had darkened, the hearth's glow casting long shadows across the floor. Holmes stood, eyes sharp as ever. Tomorrow, Watson, we call on Miss Glenbrook, and if she flees, he smiled without mirth. She won't. Guilt waits, sometimes longer than grief. The following morning dawned clear but frigid. A brittle blue sky stretched over the rooftops of Marshbank. Frost glinted on the cobblestones, and the branches of the village elms stood still and sharp. as though listening. Holmes, invigorated by the clarity of the air or the sharpening edge of his deductions, was up and dressed before sunrise. He stood at the parsonage window, gazing at the distant treetops with a far-off look in his eye. "Watson," he said, without turning, "today we knock on the door of memory, and memory will answer, whether it wishes to or not." After a quick breakfast, served by a visibly unsettled tiller, we set off down the lane toward the village green. Colonel Stratton remained behind, still coming to terms with the letters we had uncovered. Holmes had extracted one of them, the most recent, and now kept it in the inner pocket of his coat. "We do not accuse her yet," Holmes said as we walked. "We illuminate. If she is guilty, she will cast her own shadow." I had asked the constable for directions to Miss Glenbrook's residence the previous evening, and it had been given without hesitation. She lived in a modest cottage behind the old churchyard, known in the village as the schoolmistress's house. It appeared she had returned to Marshbank only recently. As we approached the ivy-clad structure, a light was visible in one of the upper windows. The smoke of a fire curled from the chimney. Holmes gave a crisp rap at the door with his knuckles. It was opened a few moments later by a woman in her early 40s, perhaps younger than she appeared at first glance. Her dark hair was braided and pinned in a crown about her head, and though her expression was neutral, her eyes betrayed a flicker of apprehension the moment she saw Holmes. "Yes?" she asked, voice even but guarded. "Miss Glenbrook?" Holmes asked with polite courtesy. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Dr. John Watson. May we speak with you for a few moments regarding the death of Mr. Harold Stratton?" She blinked once, slowly, then stepped aside. "Of course. Come in." We entered a small sitting room that smelled faintly of ink and lavender. Books lined the shelves in neat rows, and a writing desk stood in the corner, its blotter recently used. Miss Glenbrook motioned to a pair of chairs. "I will speak with you, but I have already given my statement to the local constable. I visited Harold days before he died. I had no wish to see him harmed." Holmes settled himself with that peculiar stillness of his, eyes studying her not unkindly, but with surgical precision. "We are not the police," he said softly. "We are interested only in the truth. You and Mr. Stratton knew each other long ago?" She nodded. "Before he married, before he chose another life. And you loved him still?" She paused, then answered with admirable calm. "I loved the man he once was, the man who promised me partnership, in life and in science." Holmes glanced at me briefly, as if to note something quietly verified. "And did he betray that promise?" "Yes," she said, her tone tightening ever so slightly. "He left without explanation. I learned only later of his marriage. It was not the betrayal of love that embittered me, it was the theft of our work." "Your work?" She stood and went to the writing desk, returning with a folded page, faded but legible. It was a diagram, a prototype design for a cold flame lamp, signed by both H. Stratton and E. Glenbrook. I was the one who proposed the cold burn concept, the mixture of copper salts and chemical oxidizers. Harold refined it, yes, but it was ours. Holmes studied the page. "This formula, was it ever used in demonstration?" "Once," she replied, "in 1886, before a small society in Cambridge, but it was deemed unstable and ultimately shelved. I never saw the device again." Holmes leaned back. "And when you visited him last week, did you speak of this lamp?" I reminded him of it, she said quietly. "Of what we had done, of what he had erased. You brought no device with you?" "No." Her gaze did not waver, but I spoke of the memory. I had heard whispers that he'd resumed his chemical tinkerings. I came to see whether his conscience had changed. Holmes withdrew the most recent letter from his coat pocket and placed it on the table before her. "And this?" Her hands did not reach for it, though her face paled. "He kept it?" You meant him to find it? I meant him to read it, she said sharply. To remember, but I did not kill him. Holmes tapped the table once, lightly. I believe you did not, but someone may have taken your anger, your history, and used them to craft a perfect misdirection. She stared at him in silence. We will not trouble you further today, Holmes said, standing, but I may return. There is one more thread yet to tug. As we stepped outside into the morning air, I turned to Holmes. You believe her? I asked. I believe she told the truth. But truth, Watson, is not the same as innocence. He stopped walking and looked down the road, toward the marsh that gave the village its name. She reminded him of the lantern. That was all it took. If someone else wished him dead, they now had their perfect instrument. A scientific curiosity tied to a woman with motive. A locked room, no fingerprints, no visible violence. You believe a third party overheard their meeting? Or read her letters? The question, Watson, is who? Back at the parsonage, Holmes went immediately to the study. Tiller met us there, surprised to see us return so soon. Tiller, Holmes said, were there any deliveries, any odd visitors the day after Miss Glenbrook's visit? The servant scratched his chin. Well, there was a boy from the apothecary, brought a small parcel. Mr. Stratton signed for it. Didn't seem out of the ordinary. Where is the apothecary located? Just off the High Street, sir. Name's Haskins. Minutes later, we were standing in a cramped, fragrant shop where jars of powders and dried herbs lined every wall. Behind the counter stood a thin, spectacled man with a weary smile. Mr. Haskins, Holmes began, do you recall a parcel sent to Mr. Harold Stratton 2 days before his death? The man's brow furrowed. Indeed, I do. Unusual request. Very precise. A sealed compound, mostly copper nitrate, with a stabilizer I was unfamiliar with. Said he needed it for a controlled demonstration. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And did he request it in person? Oh, no. Came by note. I have it somewhere. He rummaged in a drawer and pulled out a slip of paper. Holmes took it gently and studied the handwriting. Then he handed it to me. Compare it to the letters from Miss Glenbrook, he said quietly. I did. The difference was immediate. This is not her hand. No, Holmes murmured. Someone forged it. He turned back to Haskins. Did you recognize the messenger who collected the parcel? A boy from the post office, Edward Mullen. Quiet lad. Then we shall speak with young Mr. Mullen. We found the boy easily enough. He was sorting leaflets at the postal office, a sandy-haired youth of no more than 13. When we questioned him, he squirmed, but eventually confessed that it had not been Mr. Stratton who gave him the collection note, but a gentleman in spectacles, with a walking cane and a limp. Holmes gave a soft, pleased sigh. And there, Watson, he said, as we stepped back onto the street, is our ghost, our invisible hand, not Miss Glenbrook, but someone who wished it to look like Miss Glenbrook, someone who knew the story well enough to use it. He stared down the fog-bound village road. Tomorrow, we return to the Stratton estate and examine the will. I believe our murderer lies not in passion, but in profit. We return to the Stratton parsonage, under the deepening grey of a late autumn afternoon, the air sharp with wood smoke and the damp scent of turned earth. Holmes said little on the walk back, though his mind was clearly churning. He had entered that familiar state in which his steps seemed guided more by the march of deduction than the lay of the road. I have long since learned not to interrupt him when he is in this condition. It is best to let the machinery of his intellect grind undisturbed. Colonel Stratton met us in the drawing room, where a fire had been lit to push back the chill. He had a document spread across the writing table and looked up as we entered. You mentioned the will, Mr. Holmes, he said. I thought it prudent to locate a copy. I've been reviewing it in your absence. Holmes removed his gloves and stepped forward without preamble. Any surprises? The colonel hesitated. Not exactly. My brother had no children, no spouse remaining. The entirety of the estate, modest though it is bequeathed to me. That includes the property, his research notes, and a small fund held in trust. Holmes nodded, but I detected the faint flicker of a frown. And were you aware of this arrangement prior to his death? I suspected as much, Stratton admitted. We spoke rarely, but I knew he had no other close family. No mention of Miss Eleanor Glenbrook? None. Holmes steepled his fingers. And yet she may well have had a claim, at least an ethical one, upon the fruits of their early collaboration. That detail is significant. Do you believe she's contesting the will? The colonel asked sharply. I believe, Holmes said slowly, that someone wished to ensure she never could. Colonel Stratton blinked. Are you suggesting she was the target? I am suggesting, Holmes replied coolly, that someone, upon learning of Miss Glenbrook's visit, perhaps overhearing part of the conversation or intercepting correspondence, feared what might follow, legal challenge, exposure, or even simply a public dispute that would soil their inheritance. I watched as the colonel's face shifted. There was confusion there, certainly, but also discomfort and a touch of something else. Regret, perhaps, or fear. You're saying someone close to Harold, a servant, a neighbor, someone who stood to gain, used Miss Glenbrook's history as cover. Precisely. They knew her pain, knew of the cold flame lamp, and saw an opportunity. It required access to his habits, to his papers, and to his trust. The question is not merely who forged the note to the apothecary, but who could have. Holmes turned abruptly. Tiller. The servant arrived in the doorway within moments, wiping his hands on a rag. Yes, sir? How long have you been employed here? Just under a year, sir. Did Mr. Stratton type his own correspondence? He did, sir. Always at the desk, with that little Blickensderfer machine. Hated to write by hand. Holmes turned to Colonel Stratton. Have you employed any clerks or assistants in the handling of your own estate? Only one, Thomas Varner. He helps manage the accounts and the house in Kent. Why? Holmes was already walking toward the study. Because I suspect this case hinges not upon a lantern, or a letter, or even a grudge, but upon a typewriter, and a man clever enough to disguise greed as vengeance. We followed him into the study, where he opened the writing desk and drew out a stack of stationery, and beneath it, a narrow black instrument case. The Blickensderfer, he said, setting it atop the blotter. Watson, you recall the apothecary's note? Typed, indeed, as were several of the letters in Miss Glenbrook's possession, but her last message, the one we found, was written in ink, a handwriting sample. That is the only one she sent in her own hand. He reached into his coat and withdrew the folded apothecary note. Then, removing a sheet of onion paper from the desk's tray, he placed them side by side. Note the pressure, the uniformity of the keys, the slight lean to the right, uncommon for this machine, which tends toward leftward impression. And now, he opened the Blickensderfer and extracted the type wheel. Someone used this machine to forge that note, but not its owner. He straightened. Tiller. Who else has used this desk in the past month? No one, sir. Are you quite certain? The man faltered. Well, Mr. Varner did sit here briefly when he came to visit, but only while the colonel spoke with him. Holmes and I turned to Colonel Stratton at once. The colonel's face had gone rigid. Varner was here? Yes, Tiller said, growing nervous. 4 days before Mr. Stratton passed. Said he wanted to review some paperwork about the estate. But Mr. Stratton dismissed him quickly. He seemed annoyed. Holmes's voice was low and precise. Varner had access to the machine. Varner had motive. He knew he was not the heir. He forged a note to the apothecary, had the chemical mixture delivered, and placed it where Stratton would find it. Perhaps he even altered one of the journal pages to suggest a forgotten formula, in case the death invited scrutiny. Good Lord, I muttered. He planted the bait and let Harold ignite his own death. Holmes nodded. A murder of suggestion. Elegant, untraceable, except by someone who understands not just chemistry, but the frailty of conscience. Colonel Stratton had gone to the window, his back to us. I trusted Varner, he said quietly. I've known him since my commission. If what you say is true, then he planned this very carefully, Holmes said. But not carefully enough. We have the forged note, we have the typewriter, and I dare say we shall have Varner. He turned to Tiller. Send word to the village constable. Ask him to intercept Mr. Varner if he attempts to leave Marshbank. Tell him Sherlock Holmes suspects an impending flight. Tiller rushed off. Holmes and I remained in the study, examining the rest of the desk's contents. Holmes found a small journal, bound in leather, tucked into the back of a drawer. He opened it slowly. Watson, he said after a moment, listen to this entry, dated 3 days before the death. Eleanor appeared today. She has not aged, only hardened. She speaks of our work as if no time has passed. The guilt, long buried, rises again. I must prove, somehow, that I did not abandon her without cause. Perhaps I can replicate the flame. One more time. A gesture of atonement. He built it himself, I said. He followed the memory into a trap. Holmes closed the journal. Varner counted on that. He fed him guilt and left the materials to finish the job. Harold lit his own execution, and in doing so, unknowingly framed the very woman he wished to absolve. A knock at the study door interrupted us. Tiller re-entered, breathless. They've caught him, sir. Mr. Varner, at the train station. He had a bag packed and was asking about the next express to Dover. Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. As I suspected, the guilty flee not because they must, but because they imagine themselves too clever to be caught. Shall we go to the constable's office? I asked. In time, Holmes said. First, I should like to speak with Miss Glenbrook once more. There is a truth she deserves to hear, and a name that deserves clearing. And the lantern? I asked. He looked toward the hearth, where only ash remained. It was never the flame, Watson, he said. It was the hand that lit it, and the one that placed it there in the first place. And with that, we stepped back into the growing dusk, the case nearly solved, but not yet complete. The evening mist had begun to gather once more, as Holmes and I walked the narrow lane toward Miss Glenbrook's cottage. Lamps flickered in the windows of Marshbank's modest homes, throwing faint amber reflections onto the wet cobblestones. The village was quiet now, as though collectively holding its breath in anticipation of some final revelation. Holmes had been uncharacteristically silent since leaving the parsonage. Though the core of the case had unraveled swiftly in our last conversation, I could see he was still turning certain threads over in his mind. His lips moved faintly now and again, and once he muttered, "Too symmetrical, far too neat," though when I pressed for clarification, he simply shook his head and quickened his pace. Miss Glenbrook received us without surprise. She opened the door still wearing the same slate-grey dress, a shawl now draped around her shoulders against the evening chill. The look she gave Holmes was not wary this time, but weary, resigned to whatever truths were soon to follow. "Come in," she said. "You found something." "I have," Holmes replied, stepping inside. "And so have you, though you may not yet realize it." The sitting room was unchanged. A modest fire burned in the grate, and the tea set, from an earlier solitary meal, remained on the side table. Holmes took a seat, but did not remove his coat. "Miss Glenbrook," he said, "I came to inform you that the death of Harold Stratton has been solved. Your name, which someone sought to entangle in guilt, will not suffer the stain they intended." She stood very still beside the hearth. "Then I am grateful, but I cannot say I am surprised. Someone always pays for ambition. Only rarely is it the right person. In this case, it will be, Holmes said. The man responsible, Thomas Varner, has been apprehended at the train station. He forged your name, appropriated your old design, and lured Harold into reconstructing the cold flame lantern under the guise of private remorse. Her eyes darkened. And Harold built it willingly. He did, Holmes said gently, but with no knowledge of the altered formula Varner had arranged. He believed he was recreating your shared invention in its original form, a gesture of contrition. She sat slowly, the lines in her face deepening. So he did feel it, in the end, the weight of it. Indeed. There was a silence. Only the crackling of the fire filled the room. Then she looked up again, eyes glistening but not soft. And the motive. Money? Holmes nodded. The will left everything to Colonel Stratton. Varner stood to gain nothing unless he removed the benefactor and became indispensable to the heir. We believe he hoped to be elevated into a more formal stewardship role, perhaps even to influence the redrafting of the will. All that stood in his way was the possibility of you coming forward with a legal challenge. Her lips pressed together. He nearly succeeded. Holmes stood. He would have, if not for one fatal flaw: vanity. The forged apothecary note bore the unmistakable imprint of a typewriter with a unique lean. It matched the one at the Stratton estate. A man like Varner would think that such detail insignificant or untraceable. He was wrong. He produced a small envelope and placed it on her writing desk. Inside you'll find a letter from the constable, confirming that you are cleared of any suspicion. Colonel Stratton has also asked me to convey a personal apology. He will not contact you further, unless you wish it. She did not touch the envelope. Instead, she looked at Holmes with a sort of solemn wonder. And you? Do you believe I meant him harm? Holmes paused just for a moment. I believe you meant him to feel the burden of a wound he had long refused to see. But no, I do not believe you wished him dead. And if I had, she said, not challengingly, but thoughtfully, would it make sense to you? I understand vengeance, Holmes replied, but I understand its cost even more clearly. She nodded slowly, then looked to me. You've been very quiet, Doctor. Watson. I have only one question, I said. If Mr. Stratton had apologized, truly, and without excuse, what would you have done? Her answer was immediate. I would have forgiven him. Holmes inclined his head, and we left her to the fire and the silence. As we walked back to the inn, I noted that Holmes had resumed his earlier silence. He was watching the mist roll over the fields, his hands clasped behind his back. You said something earlier, I prompted. Too symmetrical. What did you mean? He looked at me sidelong. The story, Watson. The construction of it. Too clean. A classic villain. A forgotten invention. A betrayed woman and a remorseful man dead in a locked room. It reads like a play. But it was true, was it not? Oh, yes. But when a crime is designed to look poetic, it is usually hiding something uglier beneath the surface. And what might that be? I don't yet know, Holmes murmured, but I intend to find out. The next morning, we returned to the constable's office to speak with Thomas Varner. He had been placed in the back holding room, guarded by a burly constable with the composure of a bored terrier. Varner sat on the bench with his hands clasped loosely between his knees, calm, even serene. He looked up when we entered, but made no attempt to speak. Holmes approached the bars. A quiet man, Mr. Varner, a careful man, but not careful enough. Varner smiled faintly. I suppose it was the machine. Should have burned the note afterward. Holmes nodded. Yes, but not only that. You misjudged your audience. You thought Miss Glenbrook would run, that the sight of Harold dead, the shadow of guilt, would frighten her back into obscurity. Varner shrugged. She left once. I thought she'd do so again. Holmes studied him. But she didn't, and that's where you failed. There was a long pause. Then Varner leaned forward. You know, he said, I used to admire him. Stratton. He was brilliant once, but then he shut it all down, moved to this damp hole, buried himself in philosophy and guilt. He had ideas, still, but no will. That formula of theirs, it could have changed industries. Holmes folded his arms. And you believed you could finish what he started? I would have, Varner said, a trace of heat in his voice now. But he wouldn't open the door, wouldn't listen. So I gave him a reason, a memory, and the tools. And he took the bait, just like I knew he would. You poisoned him with his own regrets, I said. He killed himself, Varner shot back. I didn't force his hand. No, Holmes said. You merely left the match and soaked the floor in fuel. A crime of influence, more dangerous than any blade. Varner said nothing more. We left him there, alone in the cell, staring at the opposite wall. That afternoon, Holmes and I sat once more in the train compartment bound for London. The sky had cleared, and the autumn sun shone weakly across the hills. You were right, I said after a time. The crime was almost too elegant. A performance Holmes looked out the window. It was never about the lantern, Watson. That was just theater. It was about what it revealed. The fragility of genius, the cost of pride, and how easily one man's silence can be turned into another's weapon. And Miss Glenbrook? She will recover, Holmes said. Her dignity is intact, but I dare say she will never again invest her soul in a collaboration without care. We sat in silence then, the wheels clattering beneath us, London drawing near. At last Holmes turned and said, almost lightly, You know, Watson, sometimes I envy those who do not see the threads behind every curtain. They sleep more soundly. Perhaps, I said, but they wake less certain. He smiled at that, and we rode the rest of the way in peace. London greeted us with its usual grim familiarity. The smell of smoke, the clatter of carriages, and the endless procession of overcoats hurrying beneath soot-dimmed street lamps. Yet even as the city swallowed us whole once more, I sensed Holmes remained tethered in thought to Marshbank, to a question not yet fully answered. His expression, though composed, bore that tightness I had come to associate with unfinished work. We returned to Baker Street late in the evening. Mrs. Hudson had left a modest supper in the sitting room, but Holmes ignored it entirely. He went straight to his desk, removed the apothecary's note, and began comparing it to another sheet, drawn from a slim folio labeled Stratton Estate Affairs. I recognized the second sample immediately. It was Varner's original request to Colonel Stratton regarding the review of the will. You see it, don't you, Watson? Holmes said, holding the 2 pages beneath the lamplight. I leaned closer. Yes, the forger tried to mimic a careless hand in the apothecary note, but here it's unmistakable. The same spacing between characters, that faint depression on the R, even the tilt of the lines. Holmes gave a small nod of satisfaction. Precisely. But now, look at this. He produced a third sheet, this one in a different hand, far more elegant. The envelope from Miss Glenbrook, postmarked 2 days before Stratton's death. I had it sent from Marshbank while we were at the station. Why does that matter? I asked. Holmes leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Because, my dear Watson, Miss Glenbrook never sent that final letter, the one found on Stratton's desk. I froze. What do you mean? She told us she had written it. She said she meant for him to read something, that she had intended to confront him, but not that she delivered that particular note. That letter was composed by someone else. I stared at him. Varner. Holmes shook his head. Number, I believe there is yet another hand in this, one that has remained unseen, or rather, deliberately obscured. I sat heavily in the armchair beside the fire. Are you telling me there's a second forger? Not exactly. I'm telling you there may be a second motive. He stood suddenly and crossed to the bookshelf, retrieving a thin monograph on rare mineral compounds. You remember the substance found on Stratton's collar and fingers? The silvery residue. Yes, a reaction product from the lantern flame. Varna's forged designs substituted a copper nitrate mixture, but I now believe that mixture was not identical to the original cold flame formula. It produced the wrong residue, one that wouldn't have occurred if the flame had burned in its original composition. I sat forward. Then Varna didn't understand the full chemical process? Exactly. He recreated what he thought would resemble Stratton's old work, but the actual reaction, the one that left the silver residue, was from something else entirely, a more sophisticated compound, one that neither Varna nor Stratton had the knowledge to produce alone. But who, then? Holmes raised one finger. Consider, someone else knew of the cold flame lamp, someone who didn't simply want to kill Harold Stratton, but wanted to revive the invention, not for vengeance, for profit. You think Miss Glenbrook lied? No, Watson. I think Miss Glenbrook had a rival, a former pupil, a quiet admirer, or perhaps someone who worked under her and Stratton during their early collaboration, someone who had access to their abandoned designs and, more importantly, understood them better than Varna. Holmes returned to the desk, spreading out the diagram we had taken from Glenbrook's home. There's a second set of initials here, he said, tapping the faded lower corner. Barely legible. E.G., and beneath it, J.A. I bent close. That was not visible before. Faded deliberately or erased, but not fully. Glenbrook signed these plans with another collaborator. He rose again, pacing now. We were wrong to see this as a triangle. Stratton, Glenbrook, Varna. It is a square. There is one more player in this game, Watson, and it is time we found them. The following day was consumed in a blur of interviews and records. Holmes, in his relentless fashion, visited 2 university archives and 3 patent offices before returning to Baker Street just after dusk, visibly flushed with discovery. He thrust a folded page into my hand. James Ashcroft, he announced, a name long forgotten, a research assistant to Glenbrook and Stratton in the late 1870s. Quiet, diligent, and academically gifted. He faded from formal scholarship after a single joint publication, but he resurfaces 5 years ago in the private chemical sector under an alias, Jonathan Arscott. The man who bought the Marshland factory outside Reigate, I asked, recognizing the name from Holmes's earlier notes. The very same, a failed venture on paper, but a perfect site for off-record experimentation. Holmes lit a cigarette and let the smoke curl above his head. Stratton's death drew suspicion. Glenbrook's name cast a convenient shadow. Varna, ever the opportunist, used that to his advantage. But Ashcroft, he saw the opportunity first. I believe it was he who left the altered journal page for Stratton to find. I believe it was he who engineered the lantern itself. And I believe Stratton, in his guilt and confusion, followed instructions he didn't fully understand. And the final letter? I said slowly. Written in Glenbrook's tone, but not by her hand. A masterstroke of manipulation. Enough to implicate her if needed, but not enough to confront her directly. Holmes flicked ash into the tray. Varna may have believed he set the trap, but the mechanism was already built. Varna merely pulled a lever, and Ashcroft escaped notice entirely, I murmured. For now, Holmes said grimly, but not for long. We travelled to Reigate the following morning. The weather had turned again, and a damp wind swept across the open country as we approached the derelict warehouse on the marshland's edge. The building had once housed machinery, but now stood largely empty, its windows dusted with grime and its doors ajar. Holmes led the way inside, eyes scanning the shadows. The air held a distinct chemical tang. The remnants of glass tubing, Bunsen fixtures, and scorched metal pans lay scattered across benches in one rear corner. "Someone has been working here recently," Holmes murmured, "but now it is abandoned, likely since Stratton's death drew attention." He moved to a locked cabinet, and with a deft twist of his blade, pried it open. Inside were dozens of notebooks, many labeled with a scrawled J.A. Others bore chemical diagrams far beyond Varna's capacity. "Here is the truth, Watson," Holmes said softly, lifting one volume. "The real cold flame formula, improved, tested, perfected, and used, once, on the man who first dismissed it." We spent over an hour cataloguing the documents. At last, as we emerged from the warehouse, Holmes handed me a slip of paper. "Ashcroft is likely already gone, but this address, his last known lodgings under his alias, we will forward to Scotland Yard. They can begin the hunt. The rest is now evidence." I nodded, chilled by the damp and by the weight of what we'd found. "You were right," I said. "There was a square, not a triangle." Holmes gave a quiet smile. "4 points, Watson, and all had reason. One for revenge, one for greed, one for guilt, and one for legacy." He looked out over the marshland, eyes sharp and distant. "The lantern burned blue, Watson, but what it illuminated was far darker than flame. The days that followed were thick with correspondence and quiet tension. Scotland Yard had received Holmes's findings with a mix of astonishment and grudging admiration. Chief Inspector Gregson himself had visited Baker Street to review the notebooks we'd retrieved from the warehouse in Reigate, leaving our sitting room in a state of disbelief after an hour of Holmes's precise and unsparing reconstruction of the case. "2 men dead," Gregson had muttered as he stood at the door, "and a third vanished into the fog, all over a bloody lantern." "No, Inspector," Holmes had replied coolly, over what the lantern meant. "A new kind of power, or depending on the user, a new kind of weapon." Ashcroft, if indeed that was his true name, remained at large. Despite efforts to track him through rail records and witness accounts, he had vanished as efficiently as a wisp of smoke. Holmes, for his part, was not discouraged. He had secured what mattered most: the intellectual motive, the forensic proof, and the sequence of events that led to Harold Stratton's death. Yet I could see that something still gnawed at him. It was on the 3rd evening after our return from Reigate that he rose from his chair, untouched violin at his side, and said abruptly, "We missed something." I looked up from my reading. "I thought the case was concluded." "The murder is concluded," he said, beginning to pace. "Varna sits in a cell, and Ashcroft has been identified and implicated. But not everything has been accounted for. One object remains unclaimed, one movement unexplained." I followed his line of thought as best I could. "The lantern?" "Number the placement of the lantern," Holmes said, eyes now alight. "Stratton was found seated, yes? Slumped slightly to the left, head tilted back, the lantern resting on a brass tripod beside him. Yes, I remember the arrangement clearly. But here is the difficulty," Holmes said, halting by the fireplace. "The flame residue was found not only on his hands and collar, but also on the underside of the writing desk. A fine misting of that silver trace, invisible until subjected to chemical treatment." I frowned. "That doesn't follow. He lit the lantern at the tripod." "Precisely, and therein lies the contradiction. If he had done so at the tripod's height, the vapor would not have reached the underside of the desk. Someone must have placed or lit it there first, beneath the desk, and only later moved it to the tripod." "And why move it at all?" I asked. Holmes gave a sharp nod. "Because it had done its work, and the rest, the lantern, the neatness of the scene, the door bolted from the inside, was a posthumous theatre, a final arrangement." "Then Stratton didn't die alone," I said slowly. Someone was with him at the moment of death. Holmes turned toward the window, the gaslight flickering across his face. Yes, Watson. Not only with him, but close enough to hear his final breath. The realization chilled me. Then Ashcroft may not have acted alone, Holmes finished. He retrieved a letter from the mantelpiece and handed it to me. It was on thick ivory paper, neatly folded. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, confident, and oddly familiar. Mr. Holmes, I write to correct an impression. I did not kill Harold Stratton, nor did I design the device that killed him. But I knew it was coming. I watched it happen. He had asked me to come. He wished to explain himself. But by the time he spoke, the flame had already taken him. He died believing I had brought it. I did not correct him. You may expose me if you wish. But know this, some truths are too old to unbury. Let his end be the final chapter. E.g., I let the paper fall into my lap. She was there, I said. She was there. Holmes nodded, but without satisfaction. She did not construct the murder, Watson, but she allowed it to complete itself, perhaps out of pain, perhaps out of pride, or perhaps because she believed it was what he deserved. I set the letter gently on the side table. And now, Holmes said, we must choose whether justice serves only the law or the full truth. The next day we called upon Miss Glenbrook once more. She met us on the garden path, hands folded, coat buttoned high against the wind. There was no attempt at pretense in her manner, no tremor in her voice. I suppose you've read it, she said. I have, Holmes said, and I would hear the rest from you. She inclined her head slightly, and together we walked through the leaf-strewn path behind her cottage, out of earshot from any passing neighbors. I went to see him, she said simply. I told you I didn't send the final letter. That was true. But I did go that evening, when the flame had already begun to burn. He had set it himself, following instructions, I assume, from Ashcroft's false journal page. He thought it was my work, my revenge. She paused beneath a bare elm, her face pale and drawn. He looked at me with recognition, then with fear. He said, "You came." I said nothing. And then he died, quietly. Holmes did not speak, neither did I. You see, she continued, there was nothing I could say in that moment. If I had told him it wasn't my hand, it would have meant forgiveness, and I had not decided if I could offer it. So I let him believe the worst. And then, Holmes said gently, you moved the lantern. She turned to face him, eyes glistening. Yes, I lifted it to the tripod, straightened the scene. I even pulled the bolt on the door as I left. I didn't murder him, but I left it as if I had. Holmes regarded her in silence. Then he said, you made it an unsolvable riddle, or so you thought. She gave the faintest smile, but you solved it. I did not solve you, Miss Glenbrook, Holmes said quietly, nor is it my place to try. We parted with no talk of authorities. Holmes had made no mention of her, confession to Scotland Yard, and I doubted he ever would. What remained now was not a case, but a memory, a cold blue ember in the annals of Holmes's mind, to be drawn upon only when necessary. Back at Baker Street, I prepared to write the case into my private journals. Holmes watched me from across the room, his gaze distant, his fingers resting on his violin. You know, Watson, he said after some time, we search for logic in murder, because logic offers boundaries, rules, a comfort that the world is not entirely chaos. He plucked a low string absently. But sometimes the most dangerous crime, he continued, is the one done half in guilt, half in silence. No villain to catch, no hand to chain. And justice? I asked. He met my gaze. Sometimes justice is simply knowing. We sat that way for a long while, two men in a room full of answers, and none that could warm the air. The days that followed passed with an unusual quiet in Baker Street. No new cases came knocking. The fog thickened with winter's advance, and Holmes took to long hours of violin practice, punctuated by abrupt silences in which he would pause mid-phrase and stare at the floor, lost in a puzzle he was no longer trying to solve. The case of the cold flame lantern, as I had taken to calling it in my private notes, was not one Holmes discussed further. The documents, letters, diagrams, all had been bundled, labeled, and stored in one of the heavy tin boxes he kept beneath his desk, alongside the monograph on tobacco ash and the manuscript concerning the Tarleton riddle. Yet I knew the matter had not left his mind. It lingered, like the residue of the lantern itself, subtle, acrid, and not easily scrubbed away. One morning, I returned from an errand in Kensington to find Holmes standing at the fire, a letter in hand, its contents clearly agitating him. He did not speak as I entered, nor offer his customary nod of greeting. Instead, he handed the envelope to me with a short motion. The letter was unsigned. There is one more name. Look to the university records from 1879, the Chemical Society publication, on page 31. It was never just the three of them. That was all. I read it twice, then looked at Holmes. You think this is legitimate? I do, he said, pacing slowly. The handwriting is unfamiliar, and the envelope was posted from Dover, likely a decoy, but the reference is too precise to dismiss. Page 31 of the 1879 volume of the Transactions of the Chemical Society. I already retrieved a copy. The article is titled, "On the Luminescent Properties of Hydrated Salts in Controlled Atmospheres." Ashcroft's paper, I guessed. Holmes shook his head. Published under the names of Stratton, Glenbrook, and one Professor Lionel Davington. The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes spoke it with that tone of taut energy that meant a thread had just pulled taut beneath his fingertips. Davington? I echoed. You believe he's connected? Holmes nodded. He was Stratton's mentor, senior chair at Cambridge for chemical experimentation. A man of considerable reputation in academic circles until his sudden resignation in 1881. After that, he disappears from published work. No retirement notice, no obituary. It is as though he withdrew from the world. Do you think he was involved in the cold flame formula? I think he originated it, Watson, or at the very least, supervised the initial experiments. And if that is true, then the formula was not simply a collaboration between lovers or rivals. It was the byproduct of a hierarchy. Stratton and Glenbrook were pupils, Ashcroft an assistant. But Davington? He may have been the mind behind it all. I rubbed my brow. Then why stay silent? Why not claim the design? That, Holmes said, is the question. We traveled to Cambridge the following morning. The university archives were warm with gaslight and crowded with students rushing to and fro in their scarves and caps. Holmes, his long coat trailing like a shadow, moved with purpose through the narrow corridors of the library until he reached the departmental records of 1881. He leafed through 24 pages of resignation notices, tenure appointments, and committee minutes before finding what he sought. Here, he said, pointing to an entry in neat copperplate, Professor Lionel Davington. Resignation accepted, citing personal illness and intellectual exhaustion. No successor appointed at his request. Attached was a note, sealed but partially opened. Holmes lifted the flap and drew out a single-page letter, yellowed with time. To the council. I leave with deep regret. The flame is too bright. Some knowledge must sleep. I do not renounce discovery, only its cost. Do not permit further experimentation with Formula D7. It will burn more than air. L.D. Holmes folded the letter carefully, almost reverently. Formula D7, he murmured. The cold flame under a different name. And he warned them, I said, reading the line again. He tried to stop it. Yes, Holmes said, and perhaps someone didn't listen. We spent the next several hours reviewing what remained of Davington's correspondence. Most of it was dry academia, discussion of experimental methods, grants, student evaluations. But then Holmes found a sealed envelope with an address in Finchley, dated 1884. It had never been posted. Inside was a letter addressed to Harold Stratton. Harold, I have seen the revised designs. You must stop. You and Eleanor must not go further. The vapor changes the tissue. I tested it on rats. There is corrosion at the cellular level. No visible marks, but death all the same. I have burned my own notes. I suggest you do the same. Yours. Lionel Holmes let out a slow breath. He warned them both, not just of the flame, but of its silent effect. A poison without scent. A death without pain. That, Watson, was the true horror of the cold flame. Not its light, but its absence of violence. And yet Stratton kept the notes, I said. Yes, and so it seems did someone else. Holmes rose. Davington lives, I am now certain. He went into hiding or retirement. Perhaps he feared his pupils would turn his theories into something monstrous, and they did. We found Davington's last known residence through the university's pension register, a modest house on the southern edge of Hampstead Heath. That evening, after a hastily arranged cab ride through the dusky rain, we found ourselves standing before a low gate, wrapped in ivy and flanked by trees half lost in the mist. Holmes rapped the knocker twice. After a long pause, the door creaked open. An old man stood there, hunched and hollow-eyed, his beard white, his spectacles thick with grime. But his eyes, those were sharp, wary and lucid. "You are late," he said. Holmes blinked. "You expected us?" "I expected someone. They've been creeping closer for weeks. I've seen them in the trees. The lantern burns again." We were ushered inside, past shelves of closed books and a fireplace without fire. The air was cold and dry. Davington lowered himself into a worn armchair and gestured toward two wooden stools. "You've come about Stratton," he said, "and the others." Holmes inclined his head. "We know of Ashcroft. We know of the formula. We know of the letter you never posted." Davington looked into the dark hearth. "I wrote it too late. By then, Stratton had already begun testing again. He thought he could perfect it, remove the toxicity, but the poison was in the idea, not the compound. You resigned rather than destroy the work yourself," Holmes said. "I couldn't destroy what I had once loved," Davington replied. "I hoped silence would bury it. But Ashcroft, he was always the quiet one, the watcher. He never forgave me for walking away." "He took your flame and used it," Holmes said. "Killed a man with it. And he will try again," Davington said hoarsely. "It was never about vengeance for him. It was about the discovery. He wants the world to see it burn." Holmes stood. "Then we must stop him before it does." Davington closed his eyes. "You won't find him in cities. He's gone rural, off-grid, but he will return when he finds someone else to impress. He wants recognition. That will be his mistake." We stepped out into the cold once more, the mist thick as soup, and the stars hidden behind a sky of grey wool. "Well, Watson," Holmes said as we turned back toward the station, "we have our final name and our final warning. And do we write it down?" I asked. Holmes was silent a moment. "Yes," he said at last, "because if we don't, someone else will try to make it burn again." And with that, we vanished into the fog. The following week passed with the slow inevitability of falling ash. Holmes, though not idle, carried with him a tautness that I had not seen since the days of the Baskerville affair. He took no new clients, declined 3 telegrammed invitations from Scotland Yard, and spent most of his time refining his notes on the cold flame case. But more than once I saw him pause mid-sentence, fingers resting against his temple, as though reaching for something not yet within grasp. I too had my share of reflection. In my years beside Holmes, I had borne witness to murders motivated by greed, love, hatred, even sheer madness. But this had been something altogether different. A murder born not out of sudden emotion, but cultivated slowly in the soil of forgotten ideas, buried rivalries, and scientific obsession. A death forged in a laboratory and lit by a match of guilt. And yet, it was not over. Holmes confirmed as much the morning he stood at our breakfast table, reading a small column from the Times. The headline was innocuous: "Unexplained fatality in Dover laboratory." But Holmes's eyes narrowed as he scanned the article. "Listen to this, Watson," he said. "Mr. Peter Langridge, a chemical assistant at the privately funded Larkspur Experimental Lab, was discovered deceased at his workstation late Tuesday evening. No external injuries were found. The coroner notes a chemical cause is likely, though tests revealed no traceable toxin. A faint silvery substance was noted on the deceased's hands and cuffs." I set down my tea. "The same residue," I said. Holmes folded the paper slowly. "He's testing it again." "Then he's still in England?" Holmes nodded. "And growing bolder. Larkspur was once a government-adjacent facility. It was decommissioned in the last decade and sold to private buyers, names hidden behind holding companies. If Ashcroft has acquired it, it means he now has space, funding, and likely support." "Support?" Holmes looked at me with grim finality. "Science does not stay buried forever, Watson. Ideas resurface when the world is desperate enough. Someone has seen the cold flame not as a weapon, but as progress. Clean, silent combustion, endless energy. It will be repackaged and called revolutionary, and no one will ask where it came from until more bodies fall." Within the hour, we were en route to Dover. The countryside rushed past, skeletal trees clawing against the clouds. Holmes spoke little, save to summarize what he had learned through a discreet contact in the ministry. The Larkspur lab had been recently leased, legally, to a consortium under the name Heliodine Group Limited, registered offshore. The listed managing director, Mr. Jonathan Ascott. "Ashcroft's alias," Holmes muttered. "He no longer hides in shadow. He hides behind respectability." Upon arrival in Dover, we made directly for the laboratory, a squat stone building set back from the coast, its perimeter marked by a low fence and several outbuildings that once held government inspection stations. The lab itself looked closed, but a dull light flickered behind a frosted upper window. We approached the front door. It was unlocked. Inside, the place smelled of burnt copper and antiseptic. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with glass canisters, copper piping, and coiled hosing. The floors were scuffed from recent movement. On one central work table sat a metal fixture shaped like a lantern, but flatter, wider, almost like a projector. It was cold to the touch. "This is not just a light source," Holmes said, examining its aperture. "He's re-engineered it. This is directional now, focused." I followed his gaze to the wall, where a mark, faint and silvery, spread like a bloom. It shimmered in the lamplight. "Good Lord," I said. "He's weaponized it." Holmes nodded. "No longer an accident. A targeted effect, enough to incapacitate, or kill, without smoke, without noise." He moved quickly through the room, examining papers, ledgers, and a black-bound journal left conspicuously on the workbench. The last pages were fresh. Phase 3 successful. Langridge was a fool, but at least a useful one. The calibration is nearly complete. With a refined nozzle, we may concentrate the emission to a beam width of 4 inches. Safe deployment pending. I will arrange for an audience by month's end. If successful, demonstration shall follow. Holmes closed the journal. "He means to show it." "To whom?" I asked. "Investors, military backers, government clients, anyone willing to purchase the illusion of progress." Footsteps sounded outside. Holmes motioned sharply. We stepped into the side corridor just as the front door creaked open. A man entered, tall, sharp-featured, with a beard trimmed close to the chin. His clothes were neat, though dusty, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man who no longer feared discovery. He was alone. Ashcroft walked to the work table and ran a hand gently over the surface of the device. Then he opened the journal, noted a figure, and reached for a switch at the side of the lantern. Holmes stepped out silently. "I would not do that, Mr. Ashcroft." Ashcroft froze. Then, without alarm, he turned. "Mr. Holmes," he said, calm as ever, "and Dr. Watson, you've arrived sooner than I expected." "You expected us?" "I expected someone," he echoed, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Great ideas are rarely left alone, and great men," he added, "cannot resist them." Holmes took one step closer. "What you have built here is not a solution. It is a silence, one that kills." "It is control," Ashcroft said, "and you of all people should appreciate control. The cold flame was never about light. It was about power. Quiet, precise, invisible power." He tapped the lantern. "A man can hold this. Deploy it without gunpowder, without heat. It burns nothing. It leaves no mark. And it does not wait for permission." Holmes regarded him coldly. "You killed Stratton. You killed Langridge." "I awoke Stratton," Ashcroft replied. "I gave him one last chance to see what we had created. He lacked the courage. You exploited a woman's pain, destroyed a man's life, and turned a theory into a weapon." Ashcroft's eyes glinted. "It was already a weapon. I only refined it." Police sirens wailed distantly. Holmes's telegram to the Dover Constabulary, dispatched as we boarded the train, had been brief but persuasive. Ashcroft did not move as we heard vehicles approach. Holmes spoke once more, his voice low. "You could have written your name in ink, but you chose Ash." Ashcroft's smile faded. The door burst open behind him, and constables flooded the room. Holmes stepped back as Ashcroft was seized. He did not resist. As he was led out, he turned once more to Holmes. "Someone else will finish it. You know that. You've seen it. This is only the beginning." Holmes did not answer. That night, back in London, Holmes burned the journal. He did so without ceremony, feeding the pages one by one into the grate, the flames licking the words into smoke. I watched in silence. When it was done, he turned and sat in his armchair, face in shadow. "I should have seen him sooner," he said. "He was never hiding. He was waiting." "You stopped him," I said. "For now," Holmes murmured. "But we have entered a new age, Watson, where men no longer wait for nature to kill, only for the correct mechanism." I sat beside him, the fire dying low, and I realized the cold flame was not simply an invention. It was a mirror, one that showed what men could become when their brilliance outpaced their conscience. The winter deepened in London as December gave way to January. Frost painted the windows of Baker Street in delicate filigrees each morning, and the nights seemed to stretch ever longer, wrapping the city in a heavy shroud of quiet. Yet within our rooms, the shadows stirred not with silence, but with contemplation. The case of the cold flame, so dubbed by Holmes and noted as such in the now secured files at Scotland Yard, had left a residue more lasting than any chemical trace. The arrests had been made. Ashcroft, the brilliant and methodical killer, awaited trial in isolation at Wandsworth Prison. Thomas Varner had issued a full confession through his solicitor, naming Ashcroft as the guiding architect of Stratton's death and acknowledging his own role as the opportunist. Miss Glenbrook, though still publicly unmentioned, had quietly returned to Yorkshire, where she resumed teaching, and as Holmes informed me via a letter forwarded from the university, had recently submitted a paper titled "On the Ethics of Disruptive Invention." But Holmes had not, in his mind, declared the case closed. It was just past midnight when I found him again at the window, arms crossed, eyes narrowed as he watched the slow drift of fog coiling over Marylebone. "You've not slept," I said quietly. "I rest when the dust has settled," he murmured. "And this dust, Watson, has not yet touched ground." I poured him a measure of brandy and settled into my chair. "You suspect there's more?" He turned from the window. "Not more," he said. "Not in the criminal sense. The web has been cut, but something remains unresolved in the pattern. Not the facts, but what the facts reveal." He picked up a folded sheet from the table and held it between thumb and forefinger. "This arrived today, from Professor Lionel Davington. He passed it to me. Mr. Holmes, you asked me, in our last conversation, why I never destroyed the cold flame formula myself. I have since thought more deeply on the matter. There is a truth I withheld, though not by deception, by fear. I was not the originator of the cold flame. It came to me from a visiting scholar in 1875, a man from Austria who had studied under Liebig and dabbled in early combustion experiments involving low-temperature oxidizers. His name was Dr. Jacob Weiss. He died in a train accident that same year. But before he did, he showed me a prototype, one I foolishly demonstrated to a group of students, among them Stratton and Glenbrook. What I taught them was merely a fragment of what he had brought with him. And now that fragment has nearly consumed them all. The origin of the cold flame was never truly mine, nor Stratton's, nor Ashcroft's, and if it rises again, it will not be from England. Let what has burned remain burned. LD. I read it twice. A foreign origin, I said slowly. You think Weiss's work still exists somewhere? Holmes poured the rest of his brandy into the fire. The flames rose with a soft hiss. I think the cold flame is not merely a formula, Watson. It is a temptation, a pattern of thinking, a way to see the world that prioritizes elegance over consequence. Once it is imagined, it cannot be unimagined. It will re-emerge again and again, under different names, in different hands. But surely the details are contained. He turned to me sharply. You can burn a journal. You can jail a man. But you cannot burn an idea. You cannot jail a principle. If the cold flame is science, it will be rediscovered. If it is seduction, it will be reattempted. He stood, walked to the bookcase, and pulled down a thin folio, one of his own monographs, never published, titled On Patterns of Recurring Innovation in Moral Ambiguity. Tell me, Watson, he said, what links the guillotine, the atomic theory, and the cold flame? I frowned. Each emerged from intellectual revolution. Each was hailed for its precision. And each, Holmes said, was turned toward ends far removed from their creator's intentions. He set the book down and looked into the fire. This case has taught me something, Watson, that the greater threat to mankind may not be the man who murders in passion, but the one who designs a murder and calls it progress. I nodded slowly. Ashcroft believed he was building something. Holmes's eyes met mine. He was, and that is what makes it so dangerous. There was a long silence then, broken only by the creak of the fire and the distant clatter of a cart on Baker Street. At last, I said, "Then what do we do, Holmes? When the next flame burns blue?" He looked back toward the window, where the fog had begun to lift, revealing the faint outlines of chimney pots and gas lamps. "We watch," he said. "We listen, and we remind the world that the absence of heat does not mean the absence of danger. That silence can still burn." It was weeks later when we learned that Jonathan Arscott, Ashcroft, had taken his own life in his cell, using a shard of porcelain to open a vein. The newspapers reported it plainly. No details, no eulogies, no mention of the cold flame or the names it had scorched. But I noticed that Holmes, upon reading the news, said nothing for nearly an hour. When he did speak, it was this: "Even the brightest minds, Watson, may find themselves lost in darkness, especially when they believe they are the only ones who can carry the light. I recorded the case in my journals that week, every detail I could recall, every note, every letter. I did not submit it to the Strand. I placed it instead into a locked drawer, marked simply Case 187, the lantern that burned blue, and I have not opened it since. But even now, years later, I sometimes pass a shop window and glimpse a curious lantern for sale, or I see a faint flicker of light from a far-off attic, and I feel a chill not from cold, but from memory. Not all flames burn red, some burn blue, and colder still, and when they burn, they leave nothing behind, not smoke, not ash, only silence, and men like Sherlock Holmes to see what others will not. The frost had melted by early March. In the clear days that followed, the streets of London reawakened. Cabs clattered across damp cobbles, flower girls returned to their corners, and even the familiar clip of a constable's boots seemed to ring with a renewed crispness. But in our rooms at 221B Baker Street, the atmosphere remained subdued, as though the weight of the cold flame affair still lingered in the dust motes that danced in the morning light. Holmes had returned to work. He accepted 2 minor cases, both resolved in hours, but his energy was restrained, almost perfunctory. There was no triumphant violin burst, no theatrical unveiling of suspects. His mind remained half-turned toward a lantern that no longer burned, and the blue shadows it had left behind. One afternoon, as we sat opposite one another in the warmth of the fire, Holmes reached into the desk drawer and retrieved the final letter from Miss Eleanor Glenbrook. It had arrived weeks prior, unopened. Now he broke the seal. Mr. Holmes, I understand that. You may never fully forgive my silence, nor should you, but I wish to thank you, not for clearing my name, but for preserving the truth. It has value, I now see, even when spoken too late. I have taken a position abroad, in Geneva. I will not teach the cold flame, nor write of it, nor name those who did. I will teach ethics instead. That will be my penance, and my legacy. E.g. Holmes closed the letter and placed it into the fire without a word. He watched the paper curl and darken, then said softly, "She was always the only one who understood it wasn't about the science." I nodded. She understood the cost. He rose then, stepped to the window, and looked out onto Baker Street, where the spring light fell in slanted gold. For a moment, I thought he might say nothing more, but then he turned to me with a clarity that had eluded him for weeks. "There will be more, Watson. More inventions, more brilliant minds, more blue flames in other forms. We cannot stop them from appearing." "No," I said, "but we can stop them from being misused." Holmes's smile was faint, but real. "And that," he said, "is why men like you must write. Not for fame, not for admiration, but to warn, to remind, to witness." I closed my notebook then, for the final time in this case. Outside, a vendor was calling out the afternoon editions, and a boy in a cap was chasing his dog down the street. The world had moved on. But some shadows do not fade. They are simply understood. And as long as Sherlock Holmes drew breath, there would be someone to name them, to pursue them, to pull them from behind their curtains of science and into the light. The lantern had burned blue, but Holmes, ever steady, had burned brighter still.